All right, so I want to talk about why us as Chicanos, Mexicanos, indigenous people, why we need to work with, along with Black people and other oppressed, marginalized groups. And I want to talk about this from a historical standpoint, but also, an economic standpoint, and then finally from hopefully, I want to call it a movement standpoint where that has that spirit. And so, from a historical standpoint, obviously, Black and Brown people, when you look at our plight, our situation here in the United States of America, when you look at the 500 years since the coming of Columbus, and it's 500 years plus now, when you look at the more than 500 years and even more when Black people were enslaved in the slave trade, even going back to the first slave trade. When we go back to that, what we have in common is obviously it's the exploitation and the conquering of our cultures, the exploitation of our people for cheap labor, for free labor. A lot of African Americans living here today can trace their roots to Africa. We can trace our roots to places like Mexico, Central South America, and even north of Canada, because this was indigenous land. And if we have something in common, us and Black people, is that neither of us chose to be put in the situation where we find ourselves today. They find themselves here, and it's been a long time, and they still have that trauma, what's called the generational trauma. And just like us, we carry that trauma as well. Native Americans, indigenous people were traumatized, were colonized, were genocided to the point where even though we are not gone, it's still, that DNA still runs in our blood. That feeling still runs in our heart. The spirit still motivates us to stay true to some of these traditions and customs and cultural practices, even down to speaking a third language for some of us who may know about, the indigenous Nahuatl language, Mixteco, Mexica, Zapotec. These are ancient languages that are still with us today, that we still use today. And so we didn't ask to be put in this position, yet we're having a fight even today to claw out of this position, to crawl and claw out of this hole, this hellhole, I want to call it, an experiment that many people celebrate. And speaking of celebrations, today is Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday here in the United States of America, and a lot of people are going to be out there celebrating or doing whatever they're doing, to acknowledge the man. I myself am going to go do some security today for an event. Also, help out with this event. I was at a couple events this weekend, and I was really moved by the youth out there. The young people, their artwork, their speeches, their poetry. They know that there's more to life than just being exploited. They know that there's more to life than hating somebody who is exploiting them. And I love that take from the youth out there. They don't hate people. They're not hating people. They hate the situation, which is what a lot of us adults should remember. It's not the people. It's the situation we should want to hate and get ourselves out of that mess. So, Black and Brown people historically, we have a history, of having to rebel, of having to break free those chains. Even today, people would point to the prison system and the disproportionate, numbers that are in the prison that represent and the breakdown, when you break down the racial groups in prison, it's no surprise that Black people make up a large portion of that, because when you look at the history of America, when you look at the laws in America, a lot of these laws were meant to incarcerate people. A lot of these laws were meant to be unfair. Why do you think we're, acknowledging Martin Luther King Jr.? Because he stood up to, against segregation. He stood up to the racists during the Jim Crow laws. He stood up for equality. And so, we still haven't even achieved that if you look at that. But Black people have a history wrongfully and what they call the new Jim Crow, and we as indigenous people, our land was stolen. We were colonized, divided, and conquered to the point where even today we make up a big portion of those prisons as well. Dropout rates for a lot of us are very high. In other words, we rank low in education. That's both brown and Black, and even in districts where school districts and towns where people have schools that are majority Black or brown, we still rank low. One last thing for us, indigenous and Chicanos, for example, Raza Mexicana or Chicanos, one of the things we definitely can point to that is kind of a weird thing. But slavery today, farm workers, and this is not new. Farm workers are still the lowest paid, the least respected, the most persecuted today. If you look out there, profession, if you want to call it that, from gardening to farm working, we get treated as second class citizens. We don't get paid what we deserve. We don't get medical or health care. We don't get taken care of in the same way that others would. A lot of people see us as expendable, as oh, you get hurt or you call in, you're sick today, you're fired. That is basically treating us again as a second class, a group here in the United States of America. Yet we feed the world, we feed America. We, just like African Americans, we built this country. And so when you look at the railroads, for example, a lot of us were the lowest paid compared to white workers. Some of us who were out there, whether they're building the railroad or they were building other things, they were told to step aside when time came to take a picture. And this is true for a lot of minority groups or people of color, including Asians in San Francisco and places like that, African Americans who helped, and Chicanos, Mexicanos who helped build these railroads. Were told to step aside, so we were erased from history from the get-go when it came to contributions. What's sad is that today the Trump administration is doing just that. They're erasing us from history. They're whitewashing history. They're getting rid of the first whoever did this or the first whoever did that, as a purposely as a way to erase us from the history books. And so when we look at the history and the commonalities that we all share, black and brown, they're big, they're huge, and you can't avoid them. You can't ignore them. That's why today I'm going to support this MLK event. And this is an MLK event that's not put on by the city of Fresno. It's not put on by the local government, where the politicians show up and tell this whitewash story about Martin Luther King Jr. and how he had a dream and he wanted all of us to turn the other cheek and be peaceful. That's not Martin Luther King Jr. The event I'm going to today is actually one of a radical, revolutionary Martin Luther King Jr., the one they hide, the one they tried to whitewash, the one whose speeches, they leave out everything, where he questions class and keeping people poor and using bombs and spending bombs and wasting bombs to kill black and brown people on the other side of the earth, while people here go hungry. They never talk about this Martin Luther King Jr., the one who questioned white liberals and how white liberals were just as bad as your colonizer, because even though they're white liberals, they call you an ally. They don't always have the best interest in you. So Martin Luther King Jr. did more for people than people realize, and he was radical and revolutionary in that sense. Cesar Chavez, before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Corky Gonzalez, and a lot of other leaders during that time, Dolores Huerta, they were going to join Martin Luther King Jr. in this Poor People's Campaign that was scheduled to take place outside the White House, and where people were going to basically camp out in front of the White House to protest the wars in Vietnam, the wars going on, and the poor living conditions as a result of those wars. They got money for war, but can't feed the poor. To quote Tupac Shakur, that was the case back then, and they were going to make it known. Unfortunately, Martin Luther King was gunned down. And even today, a lot of people don't buy the story, the official narrative that the government gave. And so I believe that it was, obviously purposely done. That it was a murder and assassination. And we need to remember, why was Martin Luther King Jr. such a threat? And along with that, we need to take that lesson as to why he was a threat, because he's bringing people together and talking about economics, and that's number one. But also because he's bringing people together beyond race. It was about economics, obviously. And as a Chicano, as a Mexicano, when I look at some of our own leaders, back then, they were already aware of these things and talking about them. But to join up with somebody of that stature would have been a big deal. That would have been a huge achievement. Unfortunately, he was gunned down, and so today, although people are telling people go out, march, and celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and that's true. Nothing wrong with that. Let's do it, but let's do it with the right message. And as black and brown people, we need each other. We've always needed each other. I will never buy into this black and versus brown BS that comes from whether it's fiction and lies promoted on the internet to the prison, politics that people say exists. Unfortunately, that is a big problem. Don't get caught up with that foolishness. We need each other. We are here. We're fighting this fight on this January 19th as people go celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. I talked about it, this issue from a historical standpoint. I talked about this from an economical standpoint, and as far as the spiritual or motivating standpoint, where we need each other. That's what we got to hold it close to our heart, that we're people first, revolutionaries first, obviously. And when we look at our situation, our plight as Chicanos, Mexicanos, and Black people have similar challenges. And so, to quote Fred Hampton, and even Hugh Newton, but Fred Hampton said, we got two enemies. One of them is capitalism, and the other one is racism. Racism, he said, is a byproduct of capitalism. In other words, it spurns, it spans from capitalism. You can't have racism unless you have capitalism. So we need to fight capitalism together, the economic fight together. And I want to end it with that because as we take a stand today, as we go march today, as we go celebrate whatever way you celebrate today, let's do it together with one fist. Let's put that up in the air. If you're going to march, make sure they see you, hear you. Or if you're going to sit down with the panels, I'm going to be doing with some of the people today as well. Let's listen to the elders and what they've been through and what they can teach us, the mistakes they've made, right? So with that said, I'm out, and all power to the people. I hope.